There are times when the world feels off its axis, when what's happening around us is too vast, too uncertain to fully name. For many of us, the early days of the pandemic felt just like that. But for photographer Amani Willett, it also became a time to observe, to reflect, and to create. His new book, Invisible Sun, is both a visual diary and a psychological landscape, a document of life under lockdown, shaped by fear, disconnection, love, and hope. Shot in and around his home in Brooklyn, Amani's photographs are personal and poetic, showing us the ways isolation warps time and space. The images, often intimate, sometimes surreal, speak to both the vulnerability and resilience of everyday life. Amani is no stranger to weaving personal narrative with broader themes. His previous work explored fatherhood, ancestry, and political tension in America. But with Invisible Sun, the lens turns inward in a new way. It's a book about stillness, but also about quiet transformation, about what happens when we're forced to slow down and sit with uncertainty. This is Ibarian X, and welcome back to The Candid Frame. Well, Amani, welcome to The Candid Frame. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. I'm excited to talk with you.
Yeah, it's been really interesting diving into your work because it's really interesting in terms of your journey. A lot of people who start off in a particular genre of photography just kind of sort of lock themselves in. And you seem to have had a really interesting transition from, street photography into much more creative. Well, that's not right. Street photography is creative. But what I mean from it is that you create images that are less literal and then much more subjective from the point of view of the viewer. And I always think that's really kind of fascinating to see a photographer who's made that kind of transition. Talk to me about first your early explorations of photography, which started with street.
Yeah, I think you summed it up nicely. But yeah, I started with street photography in the late 90s. I was living in New York City, and that's the perfect place to be practicing street photography. I was working at Magnum Photos for a number of years, and that experience there led me to want to that was my first endeavor into photography, so it led me to want to explore the streets as a lot of their photographers had been doing and do on a regular basis. And so that was really exciting because there's an unending amount of dramas unfolding on the streets of New York. So I set out to make pictures there, but I was immediately more interested also in color and light and mood in my street photography more than the sort of like quick pun genre of street photography where there's like a visual joke that's happening. I was less interested in that, and I was more interested in creating these sort of nuanced, layered images that had, that were evocative of feelings and emotions and some ambiguity in what was going on. That was the part of street photography that really sort of drew me in, was the pictures where it was sort of unclear as to what was happening or what transpired before and after the frame, that, someone clicked the shutter, what was going on before or after that experience of that moment in time. And you were just left to try and figure out what was happening. And that was a really interesting experience for me. So I did that for a number of years and joined a street photography collective even, and was pretty invested in exploring in that way. But then I went back to school to get my MFA. And when I was there, I was working on a project and discovered the book form. And it was learning to think about my work as book projects that really sort of took me to the next phase of my career, where I was definitely much more interested in how sequences of images could construct meaning rather than creating single images on the street. And in doing so, it allowed me to really delve into playing with form and narrative and really thinking about how photographs need and rely on each other in certain circumstances. And I was really interested in how images could be, sort of layered and collected in these sequences, or even in short little diptychs or triptychs that meant something new that they couldn't mean as a single image.
Was there a book early on that was very influential on you, or sort of that really served as a spark that emphasized not just the power of the individual photograph, but the sequencing, the relationship between the images you just mentioned?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't point to a single book, I wouldn't say, but even going way back into the modernists with looking at Minor White's work, when he has a whole book that talks about sequences of images and how each sequence of images is right, and it will mean something different to each person who views the images. So, each sequence of images will have a different meaning to each viewer, even though that could be confusing. That his philosophy was that each person will bring their own bearing from their own life upon your sequence. And that was really influential to me, just that sort of statement and that idea that no matter what you do and no matter how you show your images, someone who's viewing them is going to hopefully bring to bear and take the time to look at the images and come to their own conclusions. And I was interested in how you could play with that idea to create and construct something from those pieces. And looking in, more contemporary work, there were books coming out like Red-Headed Peckerwood by Christian Patterson. I would say was a big influence when I was just starting to make books myself. That's the one book I can think of that was a pretty big influence on how I think about sequencing and images.
I think for a photographer, it's one of the harder things to sort of get a grasp on. When photographers are learning what makes a good photograph, the idea of composition, lighting, sharpness, they learn to evaluate an image just sort of based on those sort of technical aesthetic considerations. But when it comes to creating relationships, it's less obvious. I often attribute it to more of how it feels rather than being able to point to some sort of visual flourish or connective tissue between the two images. Tell me about that journey in terms of being able to use another part of the way that you look at images to get a sense of those relationships and when they're effective and when they're not.
Yeah, going to the last part of your question, when they're effective and when they're not, I think is something that's often hard to parse and is often unclear. But I was really excited about the idea that just simply by putting two images next to each other, you've created a narrative. So you can take the most two, disparate sort of images that you can possibly think of, and as soon as you put them next to each other, the viewer cannot help but try to find the connection between the two images. And that's really powerful. So there's this whole world that opens up where you can start taking images from many different sources and many different kinds of images and putting them together in a sequence that a viewer is going to try to make sense of. And I think it's just something we can't help. And especially once you put it in a book, we try to read books. We try to make sense of books. We think they should have some logic and some sense to them. And so by putting images next to each other, they do that. And when I was making my first book, Disquiet, it's a project about becoming a father during unrest during the Occupy Wall Street era of politics in our country, where it looks like child's play now, but at the time there was a bad economy, there was dysfunction in our political system, and I was bringing a child into this world. And I felt a lot of apprehension about that experience. And when I was really interested in the Occupy Wall Street movement, and I was making pictures of my family, but I was also down making pictures of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And when I put them together, it wasn't doing what I wanted the images to do. They felt too much like they were all my experience. And what I was trying to show with the book was that there was this outside force that was impacting me and my family's life. And so I found that by putting images that I found a lot of news video that I took video stills of, reshot and rephotographed on newspaper, scanned and then rephotographed again in a few different generations. And by doing so, I created this experience where there were these images of my home life that were in juxtaposition with what was happening in this outside world. And that was a really powerful way to show that. And what I noticed was that by expanding the use of imagery, right, I was going just beyond the images I was creating. I was looking outside to other forms and sources of imagery to create the story that I wanted to tell. And that was a really powerful lesson for me and experience for me and journey along my photographic sort of exploration and evolution.
When you're making the discoveries, how do you do it? Do you make prints and you put them on the floor or on a table, on a board? And how do you make those rediscoveries of these photographs that you've made?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for the first time around, it was a lot of 5x7 work prints that are shuffling around on the board, on a table, putting them in and taping them in books and looking at sequences that way. And then once I had sort of decided on a size for the book, printing out spreads and then just shuffling those around on the floor. So I had probably like 100 to 150 spreads that I was working with that I was shuffling around on the floor and then putting them together with tape and looking at the sequences that way. And as I've moved on to subsequent books, I've used InDesign more and been able to use the computer for longer. There's a point in each project where I do have to finally make, physical prints and spreads to see if the book is flowing the way I actually think it is. Because there's something about the computer where it's totally different than holding a book in your hand and having that experience. So you have to make sure it's actually translating to the physical, but I'm able to use InDesign and play around with moving spreads around that way for much longer into the process than I was at the beginning, because I have a basic understanding of what I'm trying to do.
The idea of dedicating your projects, your work to books is one that a lot of photographers aspire to, but it has a myriad of challenges, not least of which are financial. How did you come to figure out how you could sort of do that in more than just a one-off?
So my first book came out in 2013, and it was sort of right as this new wave of the sort of, golden era of photo books was arriving. And so it was at a good time where there was a real interest in books, but there was also room for new people to be involved in and be discovered. And so I had the good fortune of, putting the book out in the world and having it find some traction. And through that, I was encouraged, obviously, to keep working in the book form, because it seemed like it was resonating with people. When I was working on that project, I at first thought about it as, I wasn't even thinking about books. I was thinking about images on the wall. So I was going through that process, and it wasn't until I found the book form that I was like, this is what I need to be doing, working in this form. And so, jumping ahead, after I had the first book, it was then just a lot easier to find outlets for my subsequent books. It was easier to find people who were interested in putting those books out into the world. I would say it's much harder now. There's just the book market is so saturated, which is wonderful because there's so many photographers who have found that and discovered, like I did, that there's so much amazing. There are so many amazing possibilities within the book form. It's really an extension of your own practice, and where you can continue to put a stamp on your intentions in a really clear and concise way by using the book. But there are so many people who are now using the book form that it's, if you're trying to put those books out into the world and have people see them and get some visibility, it's much harder to do so, I would say, now than, 10, 15 years ago. And so that's sad in a way. It's great that there are so many books, but it's a lot harder to get them noticed, I would say, at this point.
Yeah. What's interesting about all your projects is that the germ of them is always something very personal. You mentioned the first book, just quite revolving about the birth of your first child. Your latest book, Invisible Sun, also takes its inception from very personal issues. Talk to me about that and how, having had the experience of several books behind you, helped you to approach this latest venture.
Yeah, I don't have a roadmap or a plan in terms of, creativity and what's going to come next. So it's been a journey where my first book was about having a child during this economic downturn in America and dysfunction in America. My second book was about tracing the path of this hermit in New Hampshire, and then my dad bought the same land that the hermit lived on 200 years later. And it was about the landscape and reconciling their experiences with that very landscape and sort of merging their experiences across centuries. My third book was about driving while Black in America, essentially, in the history of that experience. My mom is Black and my dad is white, and they're two sides of the family have had just very different experiences of driving and what it meant to have agency and mobility in America. And I could see that from a very young age. And so that book was dealing with race in America and reconciling my sort of experience with being an interracial man. And my latest book is about chronic sort of health challenges and how these health traumas have reverberated through the ages. I almost died twice when I was really young from some my intestines were tied in knots and I had to have some emergency surgeries. We were living in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania at the time. This is in the late 70s. And the medical care that was available wasn't, very sophisticated. And so the surgeries were a lot more complicated than they would be in today's age. But at the time, they were quite complicated. And I almost died twice from having to have these surgeries. And so fast forward to my adulthood, I've developed some chronic health issues. And in having them, those health issues have reawakened some younger part of me that I think hasn't really come to terms with the fact that he almost died or I almost died when I was really young. And that's popped up as sort of these traumas and sort of I don't want to say overreactions, but just having a very hard time dealing with the physical health traumas that I've experienced as an adult. And so it felt like the right time to explore those issues and explore what it means to carry that trauma throughout your life and explore how those experiences color your vision of the world. I would say that from a very young age, I've seen life as very fragile. Even, looking back to being a 4-year-old or 5-year-old, I just remember thinking that life was very fragile. And I have 2 big scars on my stomach to prove that. But with that fragility, there's also this sort of strange, innate sort of beauty in fragility, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
You can look at the world, it makes you look at the world in this very sensitive way, and you look at the magic and the mystery of it. And there's something that's very powerful about that. And so on the one hand, it's this very scary sort of mess to carry around, this load to bear of this sort of these traumas that happened to me. But at the same time, there's also this intensity to life that results, and the sort of beauty that comes from that intensity. And so I wanted to explore that sort of because it was what I've been thinking about for the last, 3 or 4 years. It's what's been on my mind. It's what I've been doing. And so I often am making work about what I'm thinking about the most at that time and what's affecting me personally. And I wanted to share that with the world, because I do think that traumas, the way they affect us both physically and mentally, have a bit of stigma around them, and people don't talk about it as much as they should. And I wanted to talk about them.
It's interesting that you're using the camera to sort of turn it inward, to explore this physical vulnerability that you were dealing with as a child and how it's impacted you later. Part of that vulnerability is also tied into the fact that you were born from an interracial marriage, right? Especially during the period during which you grew up, where the sense of otherness was probably very sort of prominent once you became aware of the fact that, people are looking at you and your parents very differently. Tell me about how that may have sort of informed how you see yourself and then how you see the world, especially through a camera.
That last part, that's a really good question, to think about that for a minute. I grew up in Cambridge, Mass, and was raised there in the late 70s. And so I was, I think, pretty lucky. It was a very liberal environment where there were people who were from similar situations as me in the late 70s even. So I was not the only kid on the block, let's say, that was coming from an interracial marriage. There were a fair number of them in my community. It was a very progressive community. So I always felt a very, intense amount of love coming from my community. I never felt othered so much, except when we stepped outside of the bubble of Cambridge. And I didn't internalize it so much as look at my parents and wonder how it made them feel. And I felt sort of this strange sense of, there's this weird sense of being embarrassed or ashamed, and wondering, how they were experiencing it, because I'm not sure if that makes sense, but, seeing how the world reacted to them made me feel a sense of shame. But it wasn't shame for me and my being. It was shame for my parents and what the decisions they'd made to get married. There were the occasional instances where people would say, oh, what a cute kid. Whose kid is that? Or my brother, who's even, much darker than I am. We've had different experiences. It's interesting that way to see how, just because, we've come from the same place and had a very similar upbringing, but the world just responds to us in very different ways because of the way that we look. And, when my dad would be with my brother, he would definitely get questions about whose kid is that? It's not your, it can't be your kid, obviously. So whose kid is it? And so questions of identity and belonging have always been at the forefront of my thinking. When I was in college, I was the president of the Interracial Students Organization, and it was a place where I felt for the first time a real sense of belonging to a community that was created by people who were, interested in being involved in the minority community, but also had a very different experience than a lot of, say, people who identified just strictly as Black or Asian. And it was more complicated. It's, just a different kind of complicated existence. So there was that, and then thinking about how it with the camera, how that changes things. That's a good question. I have been interested in issues of race, and especially when I put out my last book, A Parallel Road, which is about driving while Black, it was in 2020, 21, so right after the murder of George Floyd, and the tensions were high, and I was putting this book out in the world, and I was a little scared because some people look at me and right away know that they can tell that I'm interracial, and other people look at me and think, oh, who is this guy? He looks like a white man. And I was afraid that a lot of people would think that I didn't have the right to talk about issues of Black experience and Black identity if they didn't, initially see me in a certain way. So yeah, issues of race and identity come to bear that way. In this current project, I don't feel that race has really come to bear. It's not intrinsic to the project. We all are who we are, and so we all bring that to bear on all the projects we make and all the things that we put in the world, like it or not. I think you can't really escape, your experience. So all of that is going to be in your artistic production, no matter what. But it wasn't a project that was specifically dealing with race. But is there a better way I could answer that question for you?
No, I think you're great. With the new project, Invisible Sun, as you mentioned there, it deals with personal health issues, long-standing health issues, and typically the subject matter is very private. People don't discuss these health issues with others, even sometimes within family. The choice to explore that, photographically. You just mentioned that you had some concerns about how people would respond to it. The Parallel Road project, based on their perceptions of what race you were or weren't. But when you're exploring something that is so personal, that really speaks to your vulnerability as a human being, was there any sort of struggle or hesitancy in terms of how much of yourself you were willing to sort of expose? Even though these images are not literal, they're still very subjective to a great extent. But as the creator, you nevertheless feel that as you're putting this together, right?
Right.
Tell me about just the hurdles of that sort of personal struggle or moments of self-doubt that you have when you're creating something that's so intrinsically tied to who you are.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, in many ways, the scariest thing I've put out in the world, because for one thing, when you're working on a project like this, you're just so close to it. You're always close to your projects because they're your projects, but this one in particular, it is just so close to it emotionally. So that was something I was thinking about a lot, because it's hard to be objective about what the work is. Is this any good? Is this doing what I want it to do? Is it saying what I want it to say? But really coming back to the is this any good part, it might make sense to me. It might be something that feels important to me, but is this something that will be interesting to other people? I think that was the hardest part in this project for me to wrestle with. And I needed a few close people to me who I could share the project with and bounce my ideas off as I worked on it, because I needed some outside perspective for sure to tell me, what was working and what wasn't, or how they were experiencing what I was putting together. And so I would say that was an important part of this process, was having a few really trusted outside photographers and editors that I worked with to see if my ideas were resonating with them. And there is a balance. There's this ambiguity. I think with all my work, there's this ambiguity in what's happening. And that's just part of, going back to, now that I think about it, going back to your question about being interracial, that I think is really a fundamental aspect of my picture making and my process, is that I've always been very comfortable with ambiguity. I live in a sort of with an ambiguous identity to some extent. And I really enjoy that space of what it's allowed me in my life, being, when I travel, people often assume I'm from that country, no matter where I am. And there's this, but at the same time, it makes people uncomfortable, ambiguity. They want to put you in a box. They want to, clamp things up and label them. So, what are you? Are you black? Are you white? Do you feel more black or do you feel more white? And I always sort of tried to push away from that and say, no, I'm all of that. And I feel very comfortable in being all of that. And that's sort of ambiguous space. And I think that does translate to my photographic process and the way that I look at my projects as well. And I want them to have this sort of complexity to them where there's this ambiguity that comes from this complexity of subject matter and the way that things could be interpreted a number of different ways. And hopefully, as a viewer, hopefully different viewers have different experiences with the project. But, in terms of like how much to reveal from my current situation, it was tough because I wanted to make, I think also with most of my projects, I really think about emotion. And I think that emotion is a really great way for me to help convey what's going on in a project, the essence of a project. And so, like with A Parallel Road, even if you haven't been a black person driving on the road, say you're a white person in your late 60s, I want them to be able to relate to the project. And the way to do that is to make this heightened emotional space where it's very psychological, where people can kind of step in and say, oh, wow, I can understand, even though I haven't done that same thing, I can understand fear. I can understand apprehension. And so with this current project, it's something similar where people may not have experienced traumas in their life, any kind of traumas or, health-related traumas specifically, but they can understand the sense of sort of like cosmic wondering, and they can understand a little boy who's on a hospital bed alone in a room. They can understand, a kid falling backwards, off of off of a ledge. They can understand, how all of these things add up to the sense of vulnerability. And that's what I was aiming to do, is to help people understand this sense of sensitivity and vulnerability and fragility that permeates my life and is sort of the subject of the book.
This episode of The Candor Frame is supported by AltadenaPhotographers.org, a grassroots nonprofit created to help photographers who lost archives and gear in last year's wildfire. The organization runs a registry that lets affected photographers list the items they need replaced, from lenses and lighting to computers and film scanners. Donors, both individuals and companies, can respond with direct support. It's a photographer-to-photographer system for care and generosity. To learn how you can contribute, visit AltadenaPhotographers.org. Every donation helps someone get back to doing the work they love. The images that are part of this book don't follow a single photographic approach in terms of image making. You're playing with a lot of different things, compositing, some AI. Talk to me about the choice to use a diversity of different methods in order to achieve your goals with the book.
Yeah, I think it's just sort of natural in the way that my photographic practice has evolved. Just from, thinking back to what we were talking about with This Quiet, when I was bringing in news images and juxtaposing those with images that I made myself and having that dialogue, that opened up this new way of thinking about photographs and wanting to be able to use lots of different sorts of images and images that come from different sources in a way that could really enrich and enliven an experience and a narrative. And so with my next project, The Disappearance of Joseph Plummer, that incorporated a lot more historical images from the local historical society in New Hampshire that I then intervened with often and transformed. It incorporated my sort of intuitive way of looking at the world, which, I would say that my practice still uses a lot of the street photography ethos in a way. Like I go out in the world and I react to it and I make pictures. I don't often go out and plan pictures. I respond to the world and what's happening around me. And then the book is where I can insert the control and construct and create meaning. And so that book had, again, historical images I was making, as well as more conceptual still lifes. And so I've just become very comfortable with, or not even just comfortable, but that way of working has become really important to the way that I construct narratives using images from lots of different kinds of sources. And it's a hard way to work in some ways because, it does create this sense of, well, what is this? Doesn't mean anything at all, or what's going on here. But it feels essential for me, and it feels very natural for me to do it that way. So with this project, because there are things that there's so much in it that is, I'd say, like nonverbal, that comes from the nonverbal space and the realm of sort of the subconscious. There was a need to try to tap into, well, how can you make images that look and feel that way? And one of the things I was doing to try to deal with this sort of traumas that resurfaced as an adult was I went and did intensive ketamine therapy. And after these sessions of doing these intensive ketamine sessions, I would journal extensively. I would just, words would just pour out of me for hours with all these visions that I had during these sessions. And it was a way of processing the early childhood traumas. And what I then did was take all of those, or not all of those, but a lot of those journal entries, and I trained an AI system on my photographic library. So I put in actually hundreds of images of my own into an AI, and then I inputted the journal entries from my time doing the ketamine therapy to come up with these visions that represent, I guess, basically my subconscious. And I was really surprised when I started working on it. It just sort of a quick little idea that happened to me when I was working on the book. I was like, well, what would happen if I tried this? And I was really surprised at how representative they were of the subconscious I was feeling. And so I think they really tap into that part of my being. And so there are images made also with so aside from that, there are also images where I don't really stage my kids in doing the work, but I use my kids as stand-ins for my younger self. So I do photograph them a lot, and I photograph them in different situations. And so a lot of the younger self in the book are actually my kids.
With each book iteration, you learn different things that you didn't know before. What are some of the key things that you've learned over the course of your career that have been sort of linchpins for each successive title? And what have you learned to avoid?
That's interesting. What I've learned is to always keep being curious and to never feel like you know what something is, or for me, that I shouldn't feel like I know what a project is supposed to be before I've made it, or, how it should look, how it should feel, what the picture should look like. But to let the pictures and the experience of the project drive and inform me and inform how I should keep going with the project. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, really being open and somehow trying to maintain a sense of openness and curiosity. That's, I think, really crucial. And with each project, I always learn something new because of that openness and curiosity. I never thought I would be working with, AI. That's not something I ever really imagined doing. But it really was the thing that helped propel this project to become what I think it needed to be in the end. There are only a handful of images in the book that are made that way, but they really, lend themselves to helping to create the landscape, the sort of interior landscape that becomes really important. And in terms of things to avoid, I guess that's a harder one. I mean, I think it's sort of the same answer. It's like to avoid feeling like I know what a project should look and feel like before I begin working on it or as I'm working on it, because that really cuts yourself off to having these amazing discoveries. I think one of the things that happens as we progress and become more, I guess, we as we master our crafts, we are less curious. We're less open maybe to trying something new. We have our way of doing something and approaching some material, and we keep repeating, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. But I think that can really stunt our growth as artists. And so I've learned never to stop listening to the pictures, stop listening to not, I've learned to never stop listening to what the pictures are saying and what the project is telling me I should try, because that's where you make the most new discoveries and where the curiosity and the sort of fun and the excitement comes from in working on a project.
Even though the photographic work is all created by you, when it comes time to create a book, it's more of a collaboration between the publisher, designer, even the printer, who is responsible for manifesting this on paper. Tell me about the things that you have prioritized in terms of those relationships, because even if say a particular publisher is interested in your book, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best fit. So when you're thinking about the people that you're going to be working with and collaborating with each project, what are some of the things that you prioritize?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my first book, I kind of, I had a book dummy and I started shopping it around, and I was just hoping someone would be interested in it. That was like the main thing. And once I had that one under my belt, when I went to look for my publishing my next book, I was looking at publishers and really looking and being very curious about the way that they handled images that were more complex, or were dealing with images and projects that dealt with photographs and images that were coming from many different sources, and I was wondering about their sensitivity to working with in that way, and their sophistication with laying out images that come from different sources, and how they could do that with success, or sometimes looking at publishers who I felt like didn't do it very well at all. And so that became a real priority for me when I was looking to start thinking about where I would publish The Disappearance of Joseph Plummer. And I found a really great publisher in London that I just was on their site and loved the first couple of projects they had done and the way that they were playing with different ways of presenting images. And so I contacted them, and that turned out to be a really wonderful partnership and relationship where I thought, you're right. You need to really establish a sense of trust. You need to have that trust with your team, knowing that or feeling like they understand your goals with the project, your artistic vision, and want to really help you realize that vision. While at the same time, from my end, understanding that certain publishers have, their their own style and aesthetics, and those are going to come through no matter what. So finding that a good marriage of those two things is really quite important. And so for Disappearance of Joseph Plummer and A Parallel Road, those were published by Overlaps in London, and that was a really great fit. And then when I was looking for publishers for my new project, I knew I wanted the book to have a really sort of handmade sense to it, a handmade quality to the way the paper felt, the way that it was stitched, maybe some, small internal things like some tip-ins and such in the book. And I found this publisher in the New England area that had really made a nice, in the last, say, 7 or 8 years, a really great dent in making photo books that are handmade and really small run editions. And the publisher wanted to start expanding into doing larger editions. And so it was a really great opportunity to work with someone who was coming from this background of making handmade books, but was interested in taking that to a larger scale. And so that's what we did with this book, is sort of create this feeling of the handmade, but doing it in a way that was on a larger scale.
There's a lot of work that you put into the creation of the images and creating the book. But as many people who have done it before will tell you, the real work comes in terms of creating awareness and marketing it so that it doesn't just sit in a bunch of cardboard boxes in the garage.
Right.
So what have you learned have been really effective for you outside of whatever your publisher is doing in terms of getting the word out?
Yeah, it's really about relationships and about your community. So, I've been involved with photography since the early 2000s, so I know a lot of editors and publishers, and I know I'm a professor of photography also. I work at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. And, I've met a lot of artists that way that have come through as I've been a professor there. And so you make these connections, and it's just about, what's great about the photo book community is that it really is a community. There are a lot of people involved in it, but there's competition, obviously, but there are also a lot of people who are really just interested in helping people out and helping to make sure that things get visibility. So it's about talking to all the people that I've met, letting them know what I've been working on, and, trying to get it into a few places like small bookstores like Photo Eye or the Photo Bookstore in London. And through those communities, a lot of people involved in photo books really start, piquing their interest. It'll pique their interest, because those people tend to really be very interested in photo books and anything new and interesting that's coming along that is sort of outside the box. And so those have been, I think, really good resources, but there's definitely no magic bullet to it. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not like it was 10 or 15 years ago. It's a lot harder now to get visibility because there are just so many books. And while I think everyone in the industry is, pretty well intentioned and really do want to help people get the word out, there are just, I don't want to say too many books, but there are just so many books. It becomes harder and harder and harder. But I've been lucky enough to, have 3 books out already that people know about. And so there are certain, book collectors or people who just know about my work who will collect the work now that they know about it. They know, and they'll help spread the word as well to other people in the community. But it's a very hard thing, because there are a lot of books that are unfortunately sitting in garages that shouldn't be.
Well, my last question that I ask each guest is I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore on their own. And it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
That's a good question. I would say Ray Decarava. If people don't know his work. He is a photographer who photographed Harlem mainly Harlem, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and created this really beautiful lyrical vision of a community, of a Black community in Harlem. And he often printed his work very, very dark. And it really sort of referenced in this sense of invisibility that the Black community has in America, that they're not seen. And it's a really just powerful way to not only just make the pictures, but then once they're made, think about how to take those pictures and do something with them. It's a little bit different, just slightly, but totally changes the power of the images. And his images are just so touching and loving and honest and beautiful. I can't think of another photographer I could recommend more highly.
Yeah, I always like people who recommend his work because I'm a great fan myself. So, Amani, thank you so much, man. It was great talking with you.
Oh, thanks so much. It was really a pleasure to talk with you as well. I really appreciated being here.
Thanks to Amani for sharing such a vulnerable and nuanced body of work. You can view more about his photography and pick up a copy of Invisible Sun by visiting AmaniWillett.com or following him on Instagram. The book is a powerful reminder that even in isolation, creativity can be a path to connection. You can support the show through Patreon or a one-time donation through Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/The Candid Frame. Every contribution helps us to bring more in-depth conversations like these from photographers all over the world. And thanks, as always, to our generous community of supporters who have not only supported the show, but my family and I as we continue to recover from the effects of last year's wildfire in Altadena. Your contributions and your kindness, both big and small, made a big difference. And part of my recovery for this year is returning to teaching workshops, especially abroad. I have a workshop scheduled for Japan in May and another workshop in Vietnam in November. I'll have more information in the show notes, and you can visit our website at thecandidframe.com to find out more. Subscribe to our newsletter on Substack for deeper reflections, upcoming events, and behind-the-scenes stories from the podcast. Our audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker. And this is Ibadian X, and this is The Candid Frame.